I was born at Old Round Rock on November 10th, 1852. My mother was a Boyce, one of the old pioneer families of Texas, and my father came from Ohio as a surgeon with General Taylor during the war between the United States and Mexico, and afterwards settled in Texas. My oldest uncle, Jim Boyce, was killed and scalped by Indians on the bank of Gilliland's Creek near Austin. Like my brother, I had the usual schooling of that time, when the blue-back speller and dogwood switch were considered the principal necessities for a boy's education. All of my life I have been engaged in the cow business, taking my first job in 1869, working 18 hours a day if necessary at $15 a month, with horses furnished. In February 1872, my brother and I made our first trip on the long trail, helping to gather a herd at the old Morrow Ranch, about 2 miles from Taylor. We went through to Kansas, making about a 4-month trip in all. My wages on the trail were $60 per month, and I furnished 6 head of cow ponies. This trip was made while working for Cole Juvenile, who was from Indiana and had a lot of Indiana boys with him, whom we called Shorthorns. Myself and 2 others, Beal Pumphrey, my brother, and Taylor Pennick, were the only Texans in the bunch. One night, when we reached the South Fork of the Arkansas River, around 5 o'clock in the morning, after waking the cook, I saw our horses were being hustled and feared they would stampede the herd. Just then, the cook yelled, "Indians!" and sure enough, they had rounded up our horses and were going away with them. A heavy rain was falling, and the boss said, "You Texas boys follow the Indians and get those horses." The 2 others and I rode one day and night, having to swim rivers and creeks with our clothing fastened on our shoulders to keep them dry, making the hardest ride of my life. But we did not overtake the Indians. We were left with only 1 horse each with this herd, but had another herd nearby, and throwing the 2 together, making about 6,000 head, we took them through to Kansas. My next trip was from Llano and Mason counties. We were attacked by Indians several times, and on one occasion we lost all of our horses except the ones we were riding, and 1 man was killed by the redskins. We had to make the drive from the head of the Concho to the Pecos River, a distance of 80 miles, without water for ourselves or cattle. From there, we had a very good trip, but saw Indians nearly every day. I stayed with this outfit until the next spring, when I came back to Texas and settled in Uvalde County, and have been here ever since. I remember one trip later in the year with Dave Pryor and Ike Pryor when we were working for Bill Arnold. We got back home on the night of December 24th, and rolling up in our blankets slept in the yard, where the folks found us in the morning. In 1873, I made another trip to Kansas with Bill Murchison, and in later years took 2 other herds through to Kansas. During one of these trips, just north of the Arkansas River, we had another experience worth relating. There were about 4 or 5 big herds camped near together, and we had a very severe storm. Consequently, our herds were badly mixed, and it took us all the following day to separate them, each fellow getting his own cattle. After we had separated the cattle, we counted ours and found that we were about 15 head of cattle short. So, Mr. Murchison and I, along with 1 other man, made a circle around where the cattle were lost to see if we could find the trail where they had gone off. We finally found the trail and followed it for 10 or 15 miles when my horse was bitten by a rattlesnake. The sudden strike startled my horse, causing it to rear up and nearly throw me from the saddle. I quickly dismounted, tying off the reins to keep the horse from bolting, and examined the wound. The bite was on the lower leg, swelling rapidly as the venom took hold. We fashioned a crude tourniquet from a strip of my bandana, hoping to slow the spread of the poison. But it was clear the horse was in bad shape. With no other options, we decided to head back. The journey was slow and arduous, leading the limping horse through the darkness, every step a reminder of our precarious situation. We retraced our steps to the camp, getting the snake-bitten horse into the camp about 12 o'clock at night. During our absence, some neighbors told the bosses that we had been killed by the Osage Indians, and our men thought we had been killed until we arrived at camp. Early the next morning, we reported to our foreman, telling him that we had found the trail and that the cattle were being driven off by the Indians. He reinforced our party with one more man and sent us off again to see if we could retrieve the cattle. We did not lose much time in following the trail, but as the cattle had 2 days' start of us, we were never able to overtake them, which perhaps was a good thing, as we were poorly armed and would have likely faced 10 or 15 Indians. We rode our horses so hard the first day that we were unable to get back for 2 days, and when we finally reached our camp, both we and our horses were worn out and almost starved. It was not thought advisable to trail the cattle any further. After this second year's experience on the trail, I, with my 2 brothers, went to Llano County, where we associated ourselves with the Moss Boys, our first cousins, and for 10 years I ranched in Llano County. In '84, my brother, Mr. Kuykendall, and I moved about 12,000 cattle to Wyoming Territory, where I spent 2 years on the range. This proved not to be a very successful move for me, as we lost practically everything we put in that country. Wyoming Territory was a harsh and unforgiving land, unlike any I had experienced in Texas. The wind seemed to blow incessantly, carrying with it the sting of dust and the promise of hard times. Our days on the range were long and grueling, filled with the constant need to protect our cattle from the elements and predators. We battled blizzards that swept across the plains, turning the world into a white, swirling chaos. More than once, we had to dig our cattle out of snowdrifts, their bodies huddled together for warmth, their breaths visible in the frigid air. There were days when we could do nothing but watch as wolves circled the herd. Our nights were spent in makeshift camps, huddled around small fires, the howling winds outside our only company. Despite our best efforts, we lost many head of cattle to the relentless cold and predatory threats. The isolation was profound, with only the vast, empty plains and the distant, rugged mountains to keep us company. It was a time of endless toil and constant vigilance, where the struggle for survival was a daily reality. After that, I did not attempt any trail driving until '84 and '85. My brother Kuykendall and I had established a ranch in Greer County and drove several herds from central Texas to Greer County to stock this ranch with. One of the most memorable experiences was making a trip with old man Coleman Jones, who was boss for a herd belonging to Colonel Jack Myers. This herd was put up at the Smith and Wimberley Ranch in Gillespie County. I gained wonderful experience on this trip in the stampede. High water, hailstorms, thunder, and lightning, which played on the horns of the cattle and on my horse's ears. We suffered from cold and hunger, and often slept on wet blankets and wore wet clothing for several days and nights at a time. But it was all in the game. On one occasion, my boss sent me from the Wimberley Ranch to another ranch 20 miles away to get some bacon. At the foot of Pack Saddle Mountain in Llano County, I passed about 50 Indians who had killed a beef and were eating their breakfast, but I failed to see them as I passed. When I reached my destination, a man came and reported the presence of the Indians. I had to return over the same route I had come, so I took the best horse I had for my saddle horse and put the pack saddle and bacon on another horse. I dodged the Indians and got back to the Wimberley Ranch in safety. On another trail trip, we had a trying experience between Red River and the Great Bend of the Arkansas River on the Western Trail, when we had to go without water for 24 hours. When we finally reached water, about 600 head of the cattle bogged in the mud, and we worked all night pulling them out. When we noticed the cattle were left stuck behind, we immediately dispatched a few of the boys back to the wagon to fetch our heavy ropes and the bundle of horse hobbles. While waiting for their return, the rest of us, stripped to the belt, waded out to the cattle, assessing the situation. The bog was thick and treacherous, the kind that could swallow a man if he wasn't careful. Once the ropes arrived, we split into teams, securing the ropes around the horns of each steer and tying them off to the saddle horns of our sturdiest horses. With a coordinated effort, the riders would spur their mounts forward, straining against the weight of the mired cattle. Those of us on foot would dig and burrow around the legs of the steers, freeing them from the clinging mud. It was back-breaking work, and every freed steer meant a cheer from the men and a brief respite before moving on to the next. By dawn, we had managed to pull out nearly all the bogged cattle, their legs caked with mud, but alive and ready to move on. The sun rose on an exhausted but victorious crew, the ordeal behind us, the trail ahead once more. At another time, I was on the Smoky River in Kansas when 2,800 head stampeded. I found myself in the middle of the herd, while a cyclone and hailstorm made the frightened brutes run pell-mell. The lightning played all over the horns of the cattle and the ears of my horse, and the hail almost pounded the brim of my hat off. I stuck to the cattle all night alone, and was out only 100 head the next morning. Another time I ran all night, lost my hat in the stampede, and went through the rain bareheaded. On one trip, myself and a Negro, Emmanuel Jones, ran into a herd of buffalo in the Indian Territory and roped 2 of them. The one I lassoed got me down and trampled my shirt off, but I tied him down with a hobble I had around my waist. One day, my boss told me we were going to make a buffalo run and asked me to ride my best horse. The horse I rode was a red roan belonging to George Hill, who was afterward assassinated at Cotulla, Texas. Myself and Wash Murray rode together, and when we got into the chase, I caught a 5-year-old cow. My horse was Katie on the spot, in a case of that kind, and helped me to win the championship on that occasion. I was the only man in the party that succeeded in roping a buffalo. It made for some good eating. I met Mac Stewart, Noah Ellis, Bill Campbell, and several other old Caldwell County boys in Ellsworth, Kansas, on one of my trips. Stewart served 3 years in the Confederate Army, after which he took to trail life, and followed that for several years, then going to Mexico, where he became involved in a difficulty with an officer and killed him. He was in prison for over 10 years with the death sentence hanging over him, but through the influence of friends in this country, he was finally released and returned to Texas, dying shortly afterward. After meeting this bunch in Ellsworth, a number of us returned home together with the saddle horses. We came back down the old Chisholm Trail. While returning through the Indian Territory, we were caught in yet another cyclone and hailstorm one night while I was on guard. The wind was so strong at times it nearly blew me out of the saddle, and the hail pelted me so hard great knots were raised on my head. The next morning I found myself alone in a strange land with the horses, for I had drifted with the storm. Picking up the back trail, I started for camp, and before long in the distance I saw some people coming towards me. I thought they might be Indians, but it turned out to be Mac Stewart and others who had started out to search for me. The horse I was riding that night was raised by Black Bill Montgomery and had been taken up the trail that year by Mark Withers. 3 days later we reached Red River, which was on a big rise. We were out of grub, but had to remain there for 3 days waiting for the river to run down. We tried, but had no luck fishing along the river banks, fashioning makeshift lines from horsehair and sticks. Some of the boys scoured the scrub and woods for wild berries and roots, bringing back whatever they could find to supplement our meager rations. We also took the opportunity to mend our gear, patching up worn saddles and repairing frayed ropes, ensuring everything was in top shape for when we could finally cross the river and continue our journey. But the river only kept getting higher, so we decided to attempt the crossing. We put into the stream and with great difficulty got the horses across. Mac Stewart's horse refused to swim, and as Mac could not swim, I went to his rescue. The horse floated down the river, and Mac told me he had $300 in money and his watch tied on his saddle. Sam Henry and I then swam to the horse, took the saddle off, and came out under a bluff. We had a pretty close call, but reached the bank where we had a big reunion and something to eat. There is one incident which I feel I ought to add, as perhaps it did not fall to the lot of many of the boys to have a similar one. I am the chap who caught the blue Mustang mare. This was while we were range herding cattle in Kansas on the Smoky River near the King Hills, about 15 miles from old Fort Hays. This blue Mustang would come to our saddle horses at night and also to the river for water. The boys were all anxious to get her, had set snares made of ropes at the watering places, hoping to get her by the feet. She always managed to avoid this danger. One day the boys found her with the horses, and, on seeing them, she stampeded. I was on the range about the foot of the hills, saw her coming, and made for her with my rope ready. To get back to her herd, she had to go through a gap in the hills. I was riding a good sorrel horse, an EP horse, raised by Ed Persons of Caldwell County. I made for the gap, getting there just in time, and as she started to enter, running at breakneck speed, just in the nick of time I threw my rope. It went true and fell securely around her neck. When the rope tightened, she jerked my horse fully 30 feet, and both animals went down together, not more than 10 feet apart. I scrambled to my feet, getting out of the mix-up, but I had snagged my blue Mustang. Manuel Jones and Dan Shepard, two of the cowboys on the range, coming up about this time, helped me to further secure her, and we got her safely back to camp. In time, she responded to good treatment, made a fine saddle animal, and, with her long black mane and tail, she was a beauty of which I was justly proud. Good saddle horses could be had cheap at that time, but I sold her near Red River for $65. Looking back, you could say those were hard old times, but I never have regretted for a minute that I underwent the hardships. It was the kind of life that I loved at that time, and I only wish that I was young enough to engage in the same life again. Many of the old boys who were on the trail have passed away, but I want to wish for the few that are left that they will always graze with the lead cattle.